This event actually happened to me about a month ago. I get up every day at around 5:45 a.m. and leave for work at around 6. Usually I don't see anyone out at this time around my neighborhood. Like usual, I pull up to the stop sign and ahead of me is a small red car. Out of the blue, this massive man gets out and starts walking towards my car. I live in a less than safe area, so I'm already prepped with my 45. I take a deep breath and stare him down. But the closer he gets to me, the less crazy and angry he looks. I expected him to be some sort of lunatic or fiend, but he actually approached me rather calmly and motions me to roll down my window. I give him a close-up glance and decide, screw it. He looks just like me, just a guy on his way to work, exhausted and regretting the old 9-to-5 life. I oblige and roll down the window. He proceeds to tell me to turn slowly and look behind about 3 houses down. I do, and I notice some figure in all black is just staring at us. Dude at my window says he's seen him wandering in front of his house and others randomly for the last few weeks, but the dude always vanishes. I present my 45 and put my vehicle in park. Me and my new friend go and see who this creep is and why he's lingering outside houses and whatnot. And well, as we get closer, I can tell that this guy is enjoying himself, right there in public. I raise my 45 and tell him that I'll shoot it right off if he moves. And meanwhile, my new friend calls the cops. Long story short, the creep happens to be a registered offender, home invader, and attempted murderer. And how the guy isn't permanently in jail somewhere will always bother me. In the end, my new friend and I hang out now and cook out with our families, and it's good to know my neighbors are watching out for one another. A few months ago, a friend of mine, a nature photographer, decided to spend a whole 24 hours alone in the woods outside of our town. She wanted to get photos of the wildlife as naturally as she could for her portfolio. She wasn't afraid of being alone, as she had camped by herself many times before. She set up a tent in the middle of a small clearing and spent the day taking pictures. She filled up 4 rolls of film on that trip, but what she saw in some of those pictures has stayed with her ever since. She has changed drastically, but is trying to recover from the trauma the photos had caused her. Almost every picture was accounted for, save for 1 picture in each roll of film. These specific pictures were of her, asleep in her tent in the middle of the night. I got one more from my good old country, Mexico. I can't confirm this as a first-hand experience, but this came from my mom and she keeps contact with families, so she's up to date on what happens and when it's safe to visit. About a couple of years ago, there was a huge party, a quinceañera, where a girl was celebrating her 15th birthday. Party got wild, people were drunk, and of course there were fights. Near the end, they tried to find the birthday girl, but she was nowhere to be found. What started as a birthday girl gone missing from her party ended up resulting in her missing for days. Now, in some places it's so bad that we don't have normal police. We have state police, which is just military men walking around with M16s and armored vehicles, and of course, even they are corrupt sometimes. The state police threatened to get involved, yet the kidnappers were not afraid because, well, Mexico can be horribly corrupt. The kidnappers asked for a huge quantity of pesos to be paid in a week, but the family didn't know how to get the money. The week flew by and they ended up collecting about half of the amount required. The extortionist called, agreed to take the half, and said that she should be home soon. 2 days later, a box arrived in front of their house, and upon opening it, lay the bottom half of the girl. There was a note attached saying that if they wanted the other half, they should have paid the rest of the money. In 1996, I started law school at a big state school in the southern US. Other than studying, I spent most of my time playing MUDs over the internet until my school's IT cut me off, saying I was wasting resources. For those that didn't know, MUDs, or multi-user dungeons, are multiplayer games crafted out of text-based actions and storylines. Remember, this was the 90s. PC games weren't wildly graphic back then. Anyway, the IT cutting me off was fine with me. For like $20 a month, I could buy unlimited dial-up from some independent ISP and play all I wanted. Thus, that's what I did, and things were going well, until I started getting a lot of drop connections. Like every 20 minutes, my landline would disconnect. I lived in an apartment complex off campus, which made up of a ratio of 50-50. One half for grad students and the other half for the local rednecks. I called South Central Bell and they sent a guy out to check my line. He fixed the problem and I discovered that my phone line had been tapped. Someone in this town where I had never lived and knew no one had tapped my phone to listen to my conversations. Whenever they tried while I was on the internet, it caused enough interference to drop the connection. It wigged me out intensely, but what could I really do about it? And I just had to put it behind me. Then I left town for the summer and had my mail held at the post office until I came back for year 2. I got back in August, picked up my mail, and had them resume normal mail service to my address. 2 months later, I stopped receiving mail completely. It didn't register with me until they cut off my electricity for failure to pay a bill that I never received. The lady at the post office said someone had forwarded my mail but wouldn't tell me who or to where my mail was going. It still puzzles me to this day on what was going on there. It almost felt like there was some sort of underground ring involving the school, and that they were holding out on information. For 2 years, I worked for a commercial cleaning company. My regular job was cleaning a professional building downtown. You know, one of those office buildings that's all oral surgeons and gynecologists and that kind of thing. There were 2 security guards on shift every night. One sat in the lobby, kept an eye on it, and the other one watched the monitors in a room in the basement. I knew one of the regular guys, Doug, pretty well. When he was watching the monitors, he used to watch me on screen. If I was cleaning one of the offices, he'd look it up in the building directory and call. Sometimes to chat, but more often he'd do it to mess around, pretend to be a serial killer or something. It was dumb, but it was a pretty boring job, so I'm not complaining. So one night, I'm cleaning this really tacky oral surgeon's room. It had reflective black flooring, fake gold laid in the walls, and that really lame fake marble paint effect. I'm wiping down the chairs in the waiting area when all of a sudden one of the phones start to ring. I pick it up and there's a lot of heavy breathing, panting almost, and this sort of slurping, hissing sound, like someone sucking through their teeth. So I assume it's Doug thinking that he's being funny and I just hang up. But when I go down to the lobby on my way out, he's on his way in. He wasn't working that shift. I guess it could have been one of the guys who was on, but I've always assumed that it was someone calling from outside. Probably just a prank call, though. That's not really the end of it. You see, a few months later, I'm down in the basement with Doug watching the monitors and smoking. They cycle through different cameras on different floors, only holding for a few seconds on each. So one of the monitors switches to a camera in that same office, and I swear to God, a cabinet opens and someone small, maybe a kid or a little person, climbs out and walks in the direction of the door. Doug freezes, tells me to wait down there, and he goes up to look. So he heads out and I immediately lock the door. He doesn't come back down until nearing the end of his shift and refuses to tell me what happened other than to say that whatever the issue was dealt with. I decided to go camping with a guy that I knew. He was your typical ex-military grunt, thick-headed, always trying to talk like John Wayne. I had brought along some black powder muzzle loaders and revolvers, and he brought his LaBelle Model 1886 and about a dozen cases of Diet Coke. While he's pretty dim-witted, we share quite a strong interest in history. However, I learned pretty quick that he wasn't keen on sharing his Diet Coke. In fact, he laid the ground rules about it on day one. He was silly most times, quite entertaining for the most part, but you'll never meet someone so protective of their corn syrup. Whatever, was my thought. Night came around and I had stashed my food off about a half a mile away in a tree. He said that his was stashed too, so with the ideas of wildlife not coming around, I went to sleep pretty easily. But all of a sudden, I wake up to hear him sprinting through the woods, hollering. So I get up and sprint after him with a flashlight and musket in hand. He's cursing up a storm into the woods, and he's a pretty poor runner, so I catch up to him almost immediately. When I shine my light on him, he's got no shirt or socks on, holding his LaBelle and a flashlight, and looks completely winded. "What are you doing?" I shouted at him. "I got up to pee, and when I came back, this bear was in my tent and running off with my freaking sleeping bag." I sighed and turned to head back. On the way back to camp, I kept finding these cans of Diet Coke on the ground. And that's when it dawned on me that the bear wasn't after his sleeping bag, but it was after the sodas that he had stashed with him. The guy was probably sleeping in a pile of empty cans or something, and I threw a spare Mylar bag at him later to use to sleep, but he decided that he'd rather stay up the whole night rooting around the woods for old Slewfoot. I never saw a man so mad and driven to murder a bear. I mean, it was like the bear had slept with his wife. He still had a box left in his cooler, but he never got over that the beast would steal his sleeping bag. And to this day, he tells me the bear wanted his bag and that he definitely wasn't snuggling his Diet Coke. My friends, who will remain nameless, and I decided to go hunting a few years back. We headed out to Harrisburg and found a location near a large game land area north of the city. I mean, the hunting itself was fairly uneventful. However, we saw a lot of bucks, so that was cool, I guess. We were trekking through this valley up a stream that seemed a little flooded out, though, as a few months prior, Tropical Storm Lee had just hit the state. At one point, someone points out through the trees, and we find this old rustic, if not beat up, cabin. I chalked it up to being a cool sight for pictures, but someone else mentioned urban exploring. Of course, this idea won over the majority of the group, so exploring we went. I wasn't against the idea, but also, you hear so many cabin-in-the-woods stories that you just think it'd be best not to experience it yourself. Well, that idea was heavily ignored, so in we went. It was actually kind of boring, I won't lie. Maybe urban exploring just isn't for me, I don't know. All I kept thinking about were loose nails, splintered wood, bacteria, and stuff like that. I had not given any thought to anything more than that. Perhaps I should have, as in one of the rooms, and I swear to God, was a pentagram. The floor was stained with what I could only assume was old blood. My heart sank as someone said, "It's time to go." We began the trek back to our truck as night began to fall, and we tried to spot for deer as a way to pass time before we drove home. As for the room, the blood was probably not of a human. I mean, it may have been, but logically thinking it could have been a rabbit or even deer, since we did see quite a lot of them. About a year or two later, I went back with a handful of friends of that group, only to find that the cabin simply had collapsed in on itself. I'm sorry that this isn't some too spooky for you skinwalker in a woods story where OP shoots the evil woodland witch and escapes. But also, you hear about pentagrams in stories and see it in movies all the time, so you'd think that you'd be desensitized to it. But seeing one in person, along with a pool of old, dried blood, that's some seriously disturbing stuff, for real. Let me preface the story by telling you that it's been a long time since this happened. While it is a true story, I've had to add some details to make the story flow in a somewhat coherent fashion because I don't remember absolutely everything that happened. Also, my sequence of events may be a little messed up, but that doesn't change the fact that some of these moments are still absolutely frozen in my mind. When I was somewhere around 8 to 10 years old, I went camping with my Girl Scout troop. There were about 12 to 15 of us girls and 2 female leaders. The camp had 6 of those permanent tents made of wooden platforms, canvas covering, and bunk beds. 3 to 4 were facing the main part of the camp. 2 were set back a bit in the woods behind the picnic shelter, and behind those 2 tents was a path that led to the latrines. On the first day, we all picked out our sleeping spots, and our tent was 1 girl short. We spent the rest of the afternoon and evening doing typical Girl Scout stuff, and we spent the evening around the fire singing and eating marshmallows. The counselors finally made us go to bed at around 10 p.m. When we got to our tent, we used our flashlights to find our bunks and get settled in. It was around this time that we noticed that someone was sleeping in what would have been the empty bunk. We didn't think much of this, as it wasn't really unusual for someone to arrive at camp later than the main group, and some of the girls had gone back to their tents before the fire time was over. I am a total insomniac, and it's even worse if I'm not in my own bed. I tossed and turned trying to force myself to fall asleep that night, but it wasn't happening. After doing this for about an hour, I heard the springs of one of the other beds squeak like someone was getting up. I turned my head to see someone standing up from the previously empty cot. In the very low light, I could just make out the figure of someone standing, pausing for a moment, then moving toward the front entrance of the tent. The person opened the flap, left the tent, and I figured that whoever it was just needed to go use the bathroom. I still couldn't sleep, so I figured that I'd wait and see if I could tell who the girl was when she got back. I waited and waited, but I finally drifted off to sleep before the girl came back. When we woke the next morning, we discovered that the bed was empty, and there were no blankets or suitcases near the bed. We talked to the other girls to try to figure out who had been in our tent, but we found out that nobody had come in late, and nobody was missing from their tents. Still, there's always a chance that one of the girls got frustrated at the other girls in their tent and decided to switch out for the night. That kind of thing always happens with girls, I guess. And that night, we spent a long time around the campfire again. At some point during the evening, one of the girls stands up and starts walking towards the woods, in the opposite direction of where the tents and shelter were. As she got close to the tree line, one of the counselors called out to her to see what she was doing, but she just kept walking straight into the woods. The counselor called to her another time and then went after her. The other counselor did a head count to try to figure out who was missing. When she got to the end, she stared at us and started counting again. The other counselor came back saying that she couldn't see where the girl had gone and she needed the bigger flashlight. When she asked who was missing, the counselor who had been trying to count us said, "Nobody." The counselors even pulled out the roster to check us off, and we were all right there. We were all a little shaken up, so the counselors decided it was time for us to get to the bathrooms and get ready for bed. Everybody was a little creeped out, so we all went as a group to the bathroom. I washed up and brushed my teeth first, so I was one of the last to actually go to the toilets. As I was in there, I heard someone moving around in the stall next to me. I said something to her, probably asking if she needed toilet paper, but she didn't answer me. When I finished, I knocked on the other stall door, but nobody answered even though I could still hear noises inside and the door was locked. I went out and told one of the counselors who went back in with me to check it out. But when we went in, the door was unlocked and there was nobody there. There was no other way out of the bathroom besides the front entrance that I was standing 2 feet from when I was talking to the counselor. The girls that were in the tents that were separated from the others were a little freaked out, and they didn't want to sleep out there, but since they were right next to the counselor's tent, they were reassured and sent to bed. When we reached our tent, we saw that again there was someone in the spare bunk. This time we'd figured one of the girls from the far tent had snuck over in spite of what the counselors had said. And really, do you think any of us had the courage to lift the blanket off of that bed? We settled in for that night, and I was wishing that I could fall asleep so that I didn't have to be awake alone. Soon enough, I could hear the snores of the other girls, and I was still staring at the ceiling of the tent. And that's when I heard the springs of one of the beds squeak again. I opened my eyes and stared at what was supposed to be our vacant cot. There was someone standing up again. I could just make out the figure standing there in the dark. It stood there for about 30 seconds this time before it moved across the tent and out the flaps. Needless to say, I was too scared to scream for a counselor because I was afraid that whatever it was would come back. I laid awake for what seemed like hours staring at the tent flap, hoping that it wouldn't happen again. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember, it was morning. Again, the cot was empty. This time I told the counselor what I had seen, and they asked the girls at breakfast who had been in our tent, but none of the girls admitted to being there. All the girls in my tent had seen the figure of the cot both nights, but I was the only one who had seen it leave. That day was pretty sedated because everyone was a bit on edge, so in order to keep our minds off of it that evening, the counselors planned for us to have a bunch of snacks and games around the campfire that night. We had stuff to make little hand pies, banana boats, s'mores, and cinnamon apples. We were all planning to make absolute pigs out of ourselves. The counselors set up all the goodies in the picnic shelter, which was about 30 to 40 feet away from the campfire ring. The girls would go over and set up their snack and bring it back to the fire to cook out. When I went over, there were a few girls finishing up, and they left before I had finished making my banana boat. As I was adding my chocolate chips, there was a huge bang, like a gunshot in the woods, and it was followed by yells that seemed to be coming from different directions. I dropped my snack and went running over to the fire. Everyone had heard it, and some of the girls were near tears. As we sat there, we heard more noises and yells from the woods. The fire was in the middle of a clearing surrounded by woods, and it was an awful feeling to realize how exposed we were and that anybody could be out in the woods watching us. Instead of going to the latrines that night, most of us just went behind the tents, and the girls that were in the far tent were moved into ours. In fact, we consolidated into 2 or 3 tents by adding cots, and the counselors slept in the 4th tent. We were packed in like sardines, but everyone would sleep easier with more people nearby. We also propped up one of the flashlights on the floor to illuminate the tent as we slept. I actually fell asleep pretty quickly that night because I had had 2 sleepless nights before, but I ended up waking up at some point in the night because of some noises. I opened my eyes, but I found that the tent was now dark. It seemed that the flashlight had died at some point, and as I managed to get my bearings, I realized that the noise that I was hearing was the sound of someone getting up out of one of the cots. I nearly stopped breathing as I watched the figure stand. I had to shift my head this time to get a better look. It stood in one place even longer this time, and I couldn't stop watching. It seemed to be leaning over and looking at some of the other girls, and it started making its way between the cots towards the front flaps. As I neared my cot, I snapped my eyes shut and tried to slow my breathing, pretending I was asleep. I could hear it come to my bed, and it stood there for a long time. I presumed that it was staring at me, but I wasn't about to open my eyes and find out. Eventually it moved past me, and I heard the sound of the tent flap being opened. I still kept my eyes shut tight because I was so afraid that it was trying to trick me. And that's when I heard the most god-awful noise I'd ever heard. Have you ever watched one of those viral videos of cats trying to talk? That's honestly the most accurate way to describe it, but it was much louder. It didn't sound like a human or an animal. The sound seemed to be coming from outside of our tent and nearby. But all of a sudden, the girls in the next tent over started screaming like they were being murdered. All of our flashlights were switched on in rapid succession. We could hear the other girls still screaming and running out of their tent. We all stumbled out of our tent to see what the hell was going on, and by the time we made it out, most of the girls were near the fire pit and the counselors were headed for them. From what the girls were able to recall, they heard the horrible noise outside, and that's when they saw someone or something enter their tent. In all of the confusion, nobody saw exactly what had entered, but they had seen the figure open the tent flap. The counselors tried to console the girls, and the one that was particularly brave took a flashlight and headed toward the tent. She searched the tent, but she couldn't find anyone or anything. And we spent the rest of the night all jammed in a group near the fire, and not a single one of us got any sleep. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave early after one of the counselors discovered that the door to the dining hall had been opened and things had been moved around. Nobody but the counselors had access to the dining hall, and the doors had been padlocked the night before. Alright, X. I'm not a very supernaturally inclined person and have always shied away from anything to do with spirits. But to this day, I can't really provide any rational explanation for this story. I was camping on the eastern coast of Australia around Christmas a couple of years ago. At the time, we were using an old four-wheel drive, we being my parents and sister. It was getting towards evening and we'd been driving for a couple of hours with a particular destination in mind to camp for the night. We get to the turnoff for the national park where we were going to camp, and we get to the camping ground, and it's absolutely packed, like sardine level. I guess that's because we were in that Christmas, New Year period and a lot of people were out and about. Needless to say, we were going to need to find another place to sleep. We started to drive back along the dirt road towards the highway, a little disheartened as we didn't know any alternative spots to sleep nearby. And that's when we suddenly noticed another road leading off of one that we were on. We still had probably an hour of light, so we decided to drive down it for a while and see if it led anywhere that we could pitch a tent. It was pretty badly maintained, full of divots and potholes, but the car handled it well. We followed this road for a fair while before we ended up in a little clearing beside the bank of this broad tidal river. It was extremely beautiful, but no grass, so we decided to keep looking. We noticed that there were several roads departing from the clearing, besides the one that we entered it by. We picked one and started to drive down it as nighttime was approaching quite rapidly. I'd say that by this point we had maybe 45 minutes of light left to find somewhere. We drive through what seems like a maze of dirt roads before we ended up at this weird little car park. We seemed to be at the top of some hill with a small walking track that began at the car park leading down into the forest. We decided to scout it out, and after about a minute or two on this track, suddenly we emerge from the trees and are looking down into this absolutely gorgeous camping spot. The ground where we were standing sloped gently down to form this beautiful little gully, covered with short grass. It was really small, basically the perfect size for a couple of tents. To the left, a path between some rocky ridges led directly to the beach, which couldn't have been more than 25 meters away. To the right, the crease of the valley continued, with the grass giving way to some low-lying trees and longer grasses. We were absolutely gobsmacked. Not 5 minutes ago, we were somewhat frantically trying to find somewhere to sleep, and suddenly, we found ourselves in what I would confidently call the most beautiful camping spot I'd ever seen. However, something wasn't right. From the moment we came out of the tree line and first caught a sight of the spot, something just felt wrong. Like really, really wrong. This inexplicable simmering dread had come over us all, and we all felt it. I'm not talking about feeling a bit scared. Our bodies, on a base instinctual level, were telling us to get out of this place instantly. As we descended to the base of the valley, we noticed a black crow sitting on a lower branch of one of the trees to the right side. It was just sitting there, motionless, staring at us. That may sound creepy or cheesy, but honestly, we weren't that shook by it because Aussie crows do tend to stare. We walked out to the beach and then back, across the grass and into the trees. We were having a bit of a look around and we ended up finding this little pool of tepid water, which we'll call a billabong. It had this massive shell midden beside it, and for those that don't know, shell middens are piles of shells and other things created by Aboriginal people living in an area pre-colonization. Evidently, the Aboriginal people thought this spot was just as nice as we did. We continued through the trees, and before long, the valley ended at the bank of the same tidal river we saw earlier. It's quite something to behold. We managed to somewhat shake off our earlier fears and are feeling a little more lighthearted. We start back towards the grass, so we can head back to the car to get to our tents and begin to settle in. And again, the crow is still sitting on the branch. We're watching it for a few seconds, and then it just drops dead. It falls backwards off the branch and into the long grass. We all just look at each other, obviously horrified, and just like that, all of our earlier fears have returned. Despite these obvious warning signs, we were still set on camping here, so we got up to the car and get our stuff. We're pitching the tent when Mom decides to go collect some wood for the fire. After a while, we noticed that she hadn't came back to the camp yet. Obviously, we're already on edge, so we drop what we're doing and go look for her. We begin to walk back through the trees since she wasn't on the beach. We finally find her, but her eyes are transfixed on the surface of the pool of the water. We call out to her, and it's like she snaps out of some weird hypnotic trance. Confused, she comes back to the camp and we get everything all set up. At this point, we're probably 20 minutes from nightfall. Dad and I go out to the beach, just chatting or whatever, and we look along the top of the ridge, which looks down on the beach. And that's when we see a tall, white figure standing along the top of the cliff, looking down on us. We both just stare at it, terrified, trying to convince ourselves that it's just a rock or a tree trunk, or something rational to explain what we're seeing. It's definitely not human, whatever it is. We go back to the camp, having decided not to share what we've seen with the others, since everyone is really shook by this point. The simmering dread is becoming more and more pronounced. Him and I sit down and decide to try and unwind for a bit to get our mind off the situation. We were both into Magic the Gathering at the time, and we purchased a couple of booster packs earlier that day. So we decided to open them and have a bit of fun, opening probably 6 or 7 packs. Realized that, without fail, the rare card in each pack had been a black rare, some sort of demon or something else relating to death. This doesn't mean anything, but it was still such an eerie coincidence combined with the atmosphere of things. Once it gets dark, we decide that it'd be best to just try and sleep, so we all get into bed, but we're all too terrified to sleep. After a while, we start to drift off despite our fear, except Dad, who decides there's no way he's going to sleep, and that he may as well stay up and keep an eye on things in case he needs to protect us. He's sitting on a rock outside of the tent when he sees something out of the corner of his eye. He turns quickly and finds himself face to face with a completely white kangaroo, just staring at him. Albino kangaroos are real but extremely rare. He tells me it was at least 5 feet tall, as he recalled the tall, white figure we saw earlier. Suddenly, another immense feeling of dread overcomes him, and he decides it's time for us to leave right now. We all wake up, pack up frantically, and literally run out as quickly as we can. Get back to the car, the time being just nearly 11 p.m., and Dad claims that he hadn't slept at all, that he'd been sitting outside for no more than an hour after we all went to bed. In reality, it had been 4 hours. We somehow managed to navigate our way out of the maze of dirt roads and get back onto the highway, and words cannot describe the weight that lifted when we drove out of that place, like it honestly felt like I had just avoided death. We ended up finding an overnight spot nearby and crashed there. When we got up in the morning, and after what happened that night prior, we did a little bit of research and asked a couple of questions. Apparently, there were some gruesome Aboriginal genocides which happened within that very national park. Could it be that that valley was the location of one of them, that the spirits of the dead still lingered? On top of that, my father spoke to a friend of his who had worked closely with Aboriginal people. The albino kangaroo is a powerful symbol in Aboriginal folklore, meaning the guardian of the dead. I probably should have gone to therapy for this, but money's always been too tight. Or I guess that's just what I tell myself to avoid guilt. I've moved away from my home state and I've cut everyone out of my life. Everyone. I don't have friends where I do live, nor have I kept in contact with my family. Everyone probably thinks I'm dead, and I guess I hope to keep it that way. The following events happened right after graduating high school. It was me, my girlfriend at the time, and a mutual friend between us. All three of us had class together, and that's how we ended up becoming good friends. It was never a third wheel situation. We all put the friendship before the relationship. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't neglecting her, who I'll just refer to as Sarah. I was in love with her. She was the one. I actually thought about us prioritizing the friendship over the relationship was super healthy for us. Granted, we had only dated for about 4 months up until about then, but I really was willing to go to college with her. Besides, time is a man-made construct, or whatever people say. And anyway, as for the mutual friend, I'll just call him Tony. That summer, we began planning the massive celebration. We were adults now. We were free. The irony of it all, originally it was going to be a party, but Sarah was against that idea. That's when Tony sparked up with a big hiking event. 1 week out into the woods. Photography, camping, hiking, etc. The typical novice idea of camping, really. Sarah was hooked from the get-go, and I even voiced my concerns about going for a whole week, but I eventually caved. A week with friends and nature did sound like a great way to disconnect from the world. We packed the necessities, and I bring my bow because my parents are extremely liberal, so no guns. Tony apparently brought bear mace, and Sarah wanted to bring her dad's knives, but never actually did. We throw all of our belongings into my SUV and head out. Again, no details, but I will say that I remember the first day. It was kind of boring outside. The heat wasn't bad, but the sun wasn't out, so my pictures I took turned out pretty dreary. We must have hiked for close to 3 hours before finding a spot to settle down. We set up tents and sleeping bags, with Sarah and I sharing a tent and Tony setting up this dinky little tent for himself. Time passed differently when I was out there. Sometimes 1 hour felt like 6, and other times 1 hour was gone in the blink of an eye. Now, it was the 4th day out. We all were having an incredible time. We actually hadn't done too much intense hiking, aside from Tony attempting to climb trees. Instead, the three of us spent our time just sitting in hammocks or chairs, talking away and talking about life. We would crack jokes and then instantly get super serious and philosophical. What's past the stars? Are we the universe experiencing ourselves? And whatever else Tony's weed had us discussing. Anyway, that morning I noticed our canteens were nearing empty. I woke Sarah up to tell her that I was refilling the water and that I'd be right back, and she gave me a quick kiss before snuggling back up to my pillow. There was a clear stream about 20-something minutes from our spot, which, thinking about it now, it was stupid to camp so far away from. I guess it's easier to critique memories instead of the present time, though. I walk over to Tony's tent and ask if his canteen needs a refill. He asks if I'm heading out there alone and then hands me his bottle. I think the reason we didn't hike too often was because Tony was terrified of bears. And I mean petrified. Hell, it'd explain why he was so obsessed with trying to climb the trees. I began my hike, and at first, I'm happy that I'm alone. I get time to my thoughts and get to truly disconnect and even go on a slight detour. See, normally, we all would go together to refill, but as time went on, I couldn't help but begin to feel wrong. Not like being watched or anything cliche, I just felt wrong. That I shouldn't be doing this right now. I should be back at camp, cuddling up beside Sarah or making breakfast with Tony. I get to the stream and the urge just suddenly intensifies, like an impact to my gut. I fill up Sarah's canteen and begin to race back. I knew it'd be stupid to explain to them why I only had one filled, and I figured that I could just be like, I dropped the other bottles, let's all go back together or something. My brain kept replaying that anxiety that I just needed to get back to the campsite. I was maybe 5 to 10 minutes away from the campsite, and that's when I heard it. It sounded like moaning. I paused for a second, asking myself what the hell was happening. My next initial thought was that Tony and Sarah were hooking up or something, and that thought alone filled me with disgusting rage. It still disgusts me to this day. Another moan. I noticed the moans were very off, and I actually began to question where they were hooking up because I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't happening in rhythm, nor consistently, if you catch my drift. There'd be a moan, quite a lengthy pause, and then like a breathy gasp. I finally get to the hill by our campsite, and it's just blood. Everywhere. Clothes, pieces of tent, food, and Sarah. It's hazy, and I guess for good reason, but I remember only seeing the top half of Sarah. From her stomach down was just red. Nothing but red. For a second, my brain tried to tell me it was all a trick, that this was just some crude prank that Tony would pop out and be all like, haha, should have seen your face, man. That Sarah, the girl who I claimed to be my soulmate and that I had planned college for, would open her eyes and be like, it's just fake blood. Me and Tony planned this elaborate joke on you, and then give me a kiss. Something. Anything. But Tony never popped out, because Tony's body got dragged away, and Sarah never opened her eyes. Sarah never got to give me a kiss. I never got to hear her tell me that she loved me one last time. I never got to tell her that I wanted to go to her college. And I think that's the thing about grief. Everyone experiences it differently, but you suddenly realize all the things you're not going to be able to experience again. Once reality set in, my brain went into autopilot survival mode. I thought, grab a weapon and run. You're 3 hours away from civilization, and whatever is out here that did this will not care that you called 911. So I did just that. I grabbed my 45-pound recurve bow and ran. Should I have ran? Probably not. But again, we're quick to criticize memories. I'll be honest, I don't know what killed Sarah and Tony at the time. I don't know what dragged Tony's body away. I called the police once I got back to my car, and after questioning, they eventually let me off. My parents tried their best, and even Sarah's parents tried to console me. And I'll always respect them for that, because I expected them to be explosive and angry towards me, that it's my fault that their daughter died, and it's what I tell myself still to this day, survivor's guilt or whatnot. Apparently a few days later, they found Tony's remains. I was told over a phone call that it was a black bear attack and that there was nothing I could have done, that it seemed to be a family of black bears that attacked or something like that I was lucky to be alive. I remember someone telling me that it was fate. I didn't tell anyone. I figured they'd all discover it in the news. Bear attacks grad students. I just sold everything I had, and I mean everything, and I ditched town. I left everything behind me, and to this day, I never looked back. I've come here to you guys today because I've been trying to find a particular video. Some years ago in the early 2000s, a video was going around on internet forums similar to GIF and B, forums where people shared interest in the macabre and the disturbing sides of reality. The video still haunts me to this day. Don't get me wrong, I've seen a lot of gore videos, not like I enjoy them or anything, but my curiosity gets the better of me sometimes, I suppose. But there was just something completely unsettling about this one. There was a shot of a crowd of people in a dark room, talking and socializing. I'm not sure what kind of place it was, but I do remember large picture frames of some sort, so either it was some mansion or a motel. A muffled voice was sort of narrating things, but it was too distorted, or perhaps in a completely different language, so I couldn't make out anything that was being said. The camera focused on a single woman, dressed in white. She looked to be complaining about something, looking kind of nervous. Suddenly, her head just completely split open, like it was shot by a gun. Some people tend to the corpse while the head is falling apart, and I remember someone's comment mocking the people helping her, similar to how JFK's wife tried to pick up his remains. I could never forget the screaming and gore, not because it was the worst I've heard, but because it sounded distorted and artificial. Just as she was confirmed dead by one of the crowd members, something started coming out of her head. The best way I can describe it was a black object that had seemingly burst out from what was left of the head. The video was too grainy and the area was too dark to make out specifically what it was, but it was on the floor, moving in a frightening manner, like a newborn animal. The video shook violently for a moment before ending. I didn't think that I'd ever actually want to see it again, but it's been haunting me so much lately, so any help would mean a lot. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't let the slenderoo get you.